Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Heidi Shoup, President of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here this afternoon for our Ambassador Series briefing with His Excellency Arturo Sarukhan, the Ambassador of Mexico to the United States. This event is being filmed for the Council's weekly television program, World Affairs Today, so I'll ask you to all turn off your mobile phones at this time. Also, during the Q&A period that will follow the discussion, I don't see the microphone, but it will be brought down here, and so please ask your questions into the microphone. That way the audience here in the room and the audience at home will be able to hear your questions. Our program this afternoon will focus on the multi-layered and strategically vital and often complex relationship between Mexico and the United States. We are fortunate to have Ambassador Sarukhan with us, who will share his perspective and discuss some of the drivers affecting bilateral relations. The ambassador has had a distinguished career inside and outside of government. After graduating with a bachelor's degree in international relations from El Colegio de Mexico, he went on to receive a master's in U.S. foreign policy from Johns Hopkins SAIS here in Washington, where he studies as a Fulbright Scholar and as a Ford Foundation Fellow. He has served in various posts at the Secretariat of Foreign Affairs, including as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Inter-American Affairs, as Chief of Staff to the Ambassador in Washington during the NAFTA negotiations, as Chief of Policy Planning to the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, and as Consul General in New York. In 2006, he was granted a leave of absence from the Foreign Service to join Felipe Calderón's presidential campaign as international spokesperson and coordinator of foreign affairs. In January 2007, he was posted as ambassador to the United States. He serves on numerous boards and advisory councils and is reported to be the first ambassador in Washington to have a Twitter account. He has 70,000 followers. The ambassador is joined by Bill Schneider, currently Distinguished Senior Fellow and Resident Scholar at the Third Way, a Washington, D.C. think tank. A leading U.S. political analyst and expert on public opinion research, Bill is also the Omer L. and Nancy Hurst Professor of Public Policy at George Mason University. He has been CNN's senior political analyst since 1990 and is also a contributing editor to National Journal and the Atlantic Monthly. He has been labeled the Aristotle of American politics by the Boston Globe, and Campaigns and Elections magazine called him the most consistently intelligent analyst on television. He was a member of the CNN political team that was awarded an Emmy in 2006 for its election coverage and a Peabody for its 2008 coverage. We will look forward to the ambassador's remarks and to the discussion that will follow with Bill. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our distinguished guest.
Thank you, Heidi, and it's a great pleasure to be with you here today. It's always dangerous to engage in a conversation with Bill like the one that we will engage in after I'm done, especially as was the case with many disciples and colleagues of Aristotle. Engaging with him was never an easy task, and I'm sure it's going to be challenging, but hopefully engaging as we discuss some of the issues that I will share with you today, and I'm sure we can go into greater depth. Let me start my formal remarks here today by probably starting by suggesting or underscoring that the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship today is characterized by two buzzwords. It is a intermestic relationship, and it is a strategic relationship. And I'll define both, and I'll run down what I mean with both. Intermestic, for starters, what is intermestic? And here I'm just piggybacking on Bayless Manning. Bayless Manning, as many of you in this room know, was for many years the president of the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City, And in 1978, he wrote an essay in Foreign Affairs in which he was trying to convey the growing number of issues of the foreign policy agenda of the United States that were no longer just foreign policy, but were intertwined with domestic politics in the United States. And this is what he called intermestic, from international and domestic. And his argument was that increasingly there were a number of issues of the foreign policy agenda of the United States that were no longer either international or domestic, they were intermestic. My argument today with you here is that not only are there issues of the agenda, the foreign policy agenda of the United States that have become intermestic, but there are truly countries with whom the relationship, the bilateral relationship the United States has today is intermestic. And there are probably two countries on the face of the earth today that have a truly intermestic relationship with the United States for different reasons, and we play in different sandlots. But those two countries are Israel and Mexico. And why are these two countries, why is the foreign policy agenda with these two countries truly intermestic? Because if you look at the foreign policy, if you look at the bilateral agenda with either Israel or the United States, and look at the issues that drive that bilateral relationship, every single one of them is grounded in the domestic politics, in the constituencies, in the parochial interests of the United States, and in the case of Mexico, also in Mexico. For the bilateral agenda to move forward, for the formal diplomatic bilateral agenda to move forward, you need to take on and engage multiple domestic constituencies, members of Congress, governors, state associations, Rotary clubs, state attorney generals, to move the agenda forward. Think of the most prominent or salient issues of the US-Mexico bilateral agenda, whether it's drugs and thugs, whether it's border security, whether it's trade, whether it's North American competitiveness, whether it's water, whether it's energy, whether it's border infrastructure, any and every single one of these issues that are critically important to the US-Mexico bilateral agenda. For these issues to move forward and for the agenda to have a forward moving momentum and traction, all of these issues need to be addressed at the local, state level with domestic constituencies in the United States. If this isn't done, the agenda simply does not move forward and bogs down. The second reason why I think that this relationship has truly become intermestic is because what is happening in Mexico. And this is a story which you usually don't see or read about in the US press. Unfortunately, we've seen a bit of the dynamic of if it bleeds, it leads, and therefore the narrative and the stories in the press today are basically focused on the issue of drug-related, organized crime-related violence in Mexico. But there's also a very compelling story taking place in Mexico today, which is that as a result of 15 years of sustained, responsible macroeconomic policies that have been put into place in Mexico since the last economic crises, global economic crises that we were responsible for in Mexico. You were responsible for the 2009. We were responsible for the 1994 peso crisis, which had the potential of contaminating global financial markets. Since then, Mexico put in place a very well-regulated banking system and sustained, responsible, forward-looking macroeconomic policies. As a result of this, as a result of Mexico's decision to aggressively pursue free and fair trade through what is, along with Chile, the second largest free trade agreement network on the face of the earth, and along with what is probably by any standard, and the World Bank has underscored this several times, the most important extreme poverty alleviation program on the face of the earth. It is a program called Oportunidades, Opportunities. It's been in play now for 15 years plus. What is it? It's basically a conditional cash transfer program that targets the female head of household and gives her small credits contingent on two things happening. One, the kids are enrolled in school with passing grades, and two, she and the kids are getting their medical examinations and their vaccines on time. If any of these two variables do not materialize, the microcredits are withheld. This program single-handedly, the past 15 years, has brought more than 40 million people out of extreme poverty in Mexico. So, sustained macroeconomic policies, the most successful extreme poverty alleviation program on the face of the earth, and the growing ability of Mexico to compete and to create jobs driven by an export economy have started to change the face of Mexico. Mexico today is becoming a middle-income country. There is a real expansion of the middle classes occurring. Does this mean that there isn't inequality and extreme poverty in Mexico? Of course not. But if you look at the socioeconomic trends in Mexico, our falling birth rate, the United States birth rate in 2010 was around 2.2. Our 2.4, Mexico's was 2.2. We are becoming an older country just like you are. In the next 20, 25 years, our demographics are going to start looking a lot like what yours look like today. This is one of the reasons that explains why this past year there was zero net migration from Mexico into the United States, and why since 2006 to 2010 we have seen a 60% reduction in undocumented immigrants crossing the border into the United States. I say it's one of the reasons because I'm not going to spin you crazy by suggesting that it's just the growth, the expansion of the Mexican economy that is responsible for this. It's also because the construction sector in this country, with the collapse in 2009, suffered, and therefore that was a very important magnet for undocumented labor in the United States. No jobs, fewer immigrants willing to cross, and also enhanced security on the border, enhanced enforcement have all played a role, but the real story is that the trends on the border have significantly changed over the past couple of years. This leads us to the most vexing challenge of this being an interdomestic relationship, which is that sometimes when you look at the relationship, you seem to have a Dickensian tale of two cities. It's the best of times and it's the worst of times. It's the best of times because I'll just go into why the relationship has become strategic, and in that story you will understand why I think this is one of the best moments of the bilateral relationship. The formal diplomatic government-to-government relations between Mexico and the United States today are extremely positive. But if you look at public opinion on both sides of the border, whether it's in the United States related to spillover violence on the border or the issue of undocumented immigration in the United States, and on the Mexican side of the border, as it relates to consumption patterns of illicit drugs in the United States, the issue of guns and cash going down into Mexico, public opinion would seem to suggest that this is the worst of times in the bilateral relationship. And it is this natural tension which I think we have to address and understand. And it's going to be particularly complicated this year, 2012, because, oh, by the way, as is the case every 12 years, our two countries will be in the midst of a presidential electoral campaign at the same time, the same year. And the potential for silliness on both sides of the border, it runs in the best of families. We will see it on the Mexican side. It's happening, and it'll continue to happen on this side of the border. The challenge is, how do we Teflon coat the bilateral relationship so that some of the silliness that will be seen and heard on both sides of the border does not stick and contaminate the bilateral relationship that we have been building for the past 5 years. And this is what leads me to the second buzzword. Why is it a strategic relationship? How has it become a strategic relationship? When you think of strategic and what it means, you're thinking basically of a process that is based on long-term, sustainable, holistic policies over a long period of time. And if you look again at the template of our bilateral relationship and the issues that we have been dealing with, first with the Bush 43 administration, the first 2 years of the Calderon administration, and now with the Obama administration, we have been developing a toolbox that not only allows both countries to solve or sometimes cut through the Gordian knots of the complex issues of our bilateral agenda, but all those issues, and again, think of the list: transnational organized crime, transborder immigrant flows, competitiveness, trade, water, energy, infrastructure. All these issues are global issues. It's not a surprise that G20 has been addressing some of these, and that in other fora, a lot of these issues are dealt with globally. If you look at the toolbox of the US-Mexico bilateral relationship, the toolbox that we have developed is also extremely relevant and applicable to some of those global or regional challenges which both countries face. This is why we have been building upon this strategic relationship and the very important muscle tone that we have attained in the formal bilateral diplomatic relations on 5 strategic drivers. Number 1, no surprises here, border security. For those naysayers out there who would suggest that Mexico doesn't care about ensuring the security on our common border, they don't know what they're saying. Post 9/11, and this may or may not be popular in Mexico, but we have to continue to beat the drum and ensure that people understand this. Post 9/11, a threat to the security of the United States, or a perception of threat to the security of the United States, will completely derail the relationship that we have been building since NAFTA was approved. It's as plain, as simple, and as powerful as that. So it behooves the Mexican government to work hand in hand with the United States to ensure that our border is secure against the potential threat of transnational terrorism or against the challenge of transnational organized crime operating and moving in both directions along our border. This means that, as is the case in most of the issues of the bilateral relationship, we need to work based on a paradigm of joint responsibility. What does this mean? That as Mexico seeks to ensure that we diminish, curtail, stop the flow of drugs originating in South America and moving through Mexico on their way to the United States, we need the support of the United States to stem the flow of guns and bulk cash that cross from the United States into Mexico. Now, I know I've talked about a very delicate issue in the body politic of America today, and given that there's an urban legend out there, let me put that to rest right away. The Mexican government is not lobbying against the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment is a sovereign decision of the American people and of the American Congress, regardless of whether I personally think that you shouldn't be able to buy an armor-piercing ammo to hunt deer. But we are convinced that the Founding Fathers did not draft the Second Amendment to A, allow international organized crime to illegally buy weapons in the United States, B, to illegally cross them over an international border, and 3, to allow individuals who shouldn't be buying guns in the first place to buy guns. So what we are asking of the administration and of Congress is help us ensure that what's already in the books is applied and enforced. Help us stem the flow of guns that are feeding organized crime in Mexico. I think there's been a significant sea change in how Mexico and the United States understand the name of the game. We've already seen it since 9/11 as it relates to potential terrorist threats, and I think that this little rigmarole of sort of the Inspector Clouseau, Peter Sellers plot that we unraveled to assassinate my Saudi colleague here in Washington, D.C., is proof that the template that we have developed, Mexico and the United States, to ensure security on the border isn't just about the bilateral relationship. It also has a profound impact on other issues and challenges, whether they're extra-hemispheric or regional, that impinge upon our security. So border security will be a critical component and has been a critical driver of our dialogue and engagement. The second strategic driver is, obviously, as we deepen our security on the border, that we continue to facilitate trade and the flow of legal goods and services. That as we strengthen security, we also ensure that those $1 billion a day of trade that go back and forth across our border continue to grow. Very few people get it, but Mexico is the second largest buyer of U.S. exports on the face of the earth, after Canada. And regardless of what your area of geographical expertise or fondness is, if it's Latin America, Mexico buys more U.S. exports than all of Latin America and the Caribbean put together. If your area of expertise is Europe, we buy more U.S. exports than Germany, the UK, Italy, and the Netherlands combined. And if your area of expertise is the new sexy Asia Pacific, we are buying more U.S. exports than Japan and China put together. It is a very compelling success story that has been triggered as a result of NAFTA. There are approximately 8 million jobs in the United States directly related to trade with Mexico. So as we strengthen and enhance security on the border, one of the things that we need to be looking at too is how do we modernize port infrastructure? How do we ensure that we have the means and the technology to do non-intrusive inspection of cargo so that we don't have to open up every single one of the 76,000 trucks that cross our border in both directions every day. We need to ensure that we facilitate trade, but at the same time that that trade or that cargo is secure. So how we modernize our border infrastructure is critically important. This is the first time in the history of the bilateral relationship that, as a result of President Calderon's state visit to Washington in May, we have a holistic border vision. It's called the 21st Century Border Vision, in which instead of stovepiping the different issues of the border, we have put them under one single template and ensure that we are moving all the issues that are relevant to border management together. The third strategic driver of the bilateral relationship is obviously energy. And it's not only in terms of energy efficiency, but also energy security. How do we efficiently exploit renewable, non-renewable sources of energy in North America? But how do we ensure that we create a common paradigm for North American energy security? One that will both A, help wean the US from less reliable sources of oil elsewhere, and B, that will provide Canada, the United States, and Mexico with the means and the ability to continue to grow. And again, most people tend to forget that on any given day, depending on the price of oil and the fluctuation in the market, it is either Canada or Mexico that is the #1 or #2 provider of oil to the United States. It's not Saudi Arabia, it's not Russia, it's not Venezuela. It's Canada and it's Mexico. So how do we continue to build upon this very important footprint? And how do three countries that have both the resources and the technological savvy start thinking of and looking at green jobs and renewable energy sources in North America? The fourth strategic driver, obviously linked to this, is how do we continue to create economic well-being on both sides of the border? And one issue that is intimately linked to this is not only how do we continue to ensure North American competitiveness vis-a-vis the Chinas and Indias of the world, but how does human capital play a role in this? And this isn't a euphemism for labor mobility and immigration. It's the ability of companies in Canada, in Mexico, or the United States to shop around freely for the best available talent. But it also has to do with solving what is probably the most vexing and the most important issue for the future well-being of our bilateral relationship, which is immigration. And again, as in most things in life in this bilateral agenda, you need two to tango. You need, on the one hand, the United States solving and addressing a dysfunctional immigration policy, but at the same time, Mexico, on its side of the border, being able to continue to grow at the almost 5% that we grew last year at a sustained level for us to be able to anchor those women and men in Mexico. Because, to put it very plainly, our loss is your gain. If we can't hold on to these talented entrepreneurial women and men, Mexico will not be able to grow at the rate of growth that we need to bridge the economic asymmetries that still persist between Mexico and the United States. So we need to continue to grow at the rates of growth that we've seen since 2009, 5% growth, 3.1 inflation, 4.2 unemployment. I'd guess that several countries, including this one, would give 2 arms and 2 legs for those numbers right now. But Mexico needs to sustain that over a long period of time so we can really start changing the dynamics of the economic asymmetry that exists and which in many ways explain the push-pull effect of undocumented labor across our borders. So this is going to be one of the most important issues that we will have to face eventually. And there will have to be some heavy lifting occurring on the Mexican side of the border to ensure that every Mexican that crosses the border does so through a designated port of entry and with a visa and a passport. But on the other hand, the political commitment and will in the United States to address a system which has not worked. The last strategic driver of how Mexico and the United States have been working together these past years has to do with global and regional policy. For a country like mine that is certainly a cultural superpower but is not a military superpower on the face of the earth, there are 2 ways to go about the world. You either sit at the table or you're on the menu. And I want to make sure that Mexico is sitting at the table by deepening the strategic dialogue between Mexico and the United States in multilateral fora, whether it's the UN or the G20, which we will be presiding this coming June in Los Cabos in Mexico, whether it's at APEC, or whether it's how we bilaterally discuss relevant issues within the hemisphere and beyond, and how we deepen that footprint, because I am convinced that Mexico is building its diplomatic footprint based on a post-Westphalian 21st century rules-based international system. How we deepen that dialogue with the United States will have a profound impact on our ability to lead and engage where we have common interests. Just look at how Mexico and the United States worked hand in hand when we were presiding the UN Security Council in June of 2010, when both countries worked together to marshal the votes to send Iran, for example, an equivocal message regarding its obligation to comply with the Pacific use of nuclear energy. This is the type of dialogue and engagement that I think for Mexico and the United States is critical. Another example, how we have worked with the United States in providing, through our autonomous electoral body, IFE, which has had a stellar reputation since it was created in the 90s, electoral assistance and training in places like Egypt, for example, to ensure that the Arab Spring morphs into an Arab summer. This is the type of dialogue that several years back was absent from the bilateral agenda, and which today is a central component of our bilateral dialogue. At the end of the day, what I'm trying to suggest here is that Mexico are finally moving away from playing checkers and are starting to play chess. There is a strategic direction and traction to this relationship that was absent before NAFTA was signed, and which has accelerated these past 5 years. In many ways, what I think sums this up is that, and I'll bring Octavio Paz to bear here. Octavio Paz was one of Mexico's Nobel laureates. In an essay about the relationship between Mexico and the United States that he wrote many years ago, he sort of pondered, Mexico and the United States have always had a hard time understanding one another because Mexicans don't know how to speak out and Americans don't know how to listen. One of the fundamental things that has changed today is that Mexico has started to speak out and America's finally tuning in. And this is completely changing the template of the bilateral relationship. Does this mean that everything is rosy and peachy and there aren't challenges in the bilateral agenda? Of course not. In an agenda and a relationship as complex and as diverse as the one that we have, there will always be outstanding issues that we will need to tackle. But I think the strategic direction that we have achieved today in this bilateral agenda is critically important, and it is one that we will have to ensure continues after I'm good, I'm not that good. I don't know what's going to happen in November here, but what I do know is that Mexico will have a new president. And one of the things that we need to ensure is that we can continue to build upon this huge sea change that has occurred in the bilateral relationship so that we can continue to deepen and widen this strategic relationship between Mexico and the United States. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. A Mexican expert at a conference I attended some years ago once warned, either Mexico gets jobs or the United States gets Mexicans. The news you brought about the progress of the Mexican economy is therefore extremely welcome, and given the low birth rate, which comes as a bit of a surprise to me and to many people here, I think, you will soon be coping with the problem of a flood of undocumented American workers crossing the border to get jobs in Mexico. As many people here know, the United States and 8 other Pacific nations are negotiating a new market opening arrangement called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Mexico, as well as Canada and Japan, has expressed possible interest in joining the TPP negotiations. It's a very diverse group of countries. I think Singapore, New Zealand, Chile, Brunei, but there are other countries, including the United States and Japan, involved in negotiations. What can you share with us about Mexico's ongoing efforts to evaluate the pros and cons of joining the TPP, and what are the key sticking points from Mexico's standpoint?
This is thanks, Bill, because I was giving a speech about the TPP this morning at the IDB and the Council of the Americas, so this is a welcome question. Look, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, is probably the next logical stepping stone in the deepening of free and fair trade. And in many ways, it is the second generation free trade agreement. In many ways, NAFTA was the first one. And 15 years plus into NAFTA, obviously there are a lot of limitations, and the world has changed considerably since NAFTA was negotiated and approved. And TPP is sort of what the next generation of free trade agreements should look like. Many of you will be asking, well, but doesn't this run counter to achieving success in Doha? Let's be very clear and very, very candid. Doha is stuck. And in many ways, I see TPP as sort of the Drano in the system. It can really, deepen and enhance North American competitiveness and the share of North America in global trade. And it can also enhance trans-Pacific trade. Without the possible, Mexico has formally announced that we are seeking to initiate negotiations to enter into TPP, to achieve TPP status. We think it makes a lot of sense, not only because of how connected the supply chains in North America are and how logical it would be for the three North American countries, the United States, which is already a member of TPP, and Canada and Mexico, that during the APEC summit in Hawaii at the end of last year announced that we were seeking TPP status. For the three countries to enhance our competitiveness, to enhance trade, to create jobs by engaging in trans-Pacific trade. It also makes sense because it is binding a group of like-minded nations in Latin America that have free trade agreements amongst themselves, that all are Pacific Rim nations, and that in the case of two of them are APEC nations, Mexico and Chile. Colombia has requested APEC status. And this alliance of the Pacific, as we have called it, this group of Latin American countries, Mexico, Chile, Peru, Colombia, Panama is now also coming into the fold, is the logical next step in recreating not only a regional geostrategic architecture, but of understanding the critical role that trans-Pacific trade will play in the coming years to create jobs, to enhance competitiveness, and to boost our economy. So this is a very important piece of the Mexican jigsaw puzzle as it looks at the world, as it looks at its trade and economic footprint, and as it rethinks what its geostrategic approach to the region and to the world needs to look like.
You talked about NAFTA for a moment in your remarks. As many of you may remember, the giant sucking sound that we were warned would happen if NAFTA were passed. Well, I'm able here to reveal that NAFTA, since it has passed and been implemented, is actually very unpopular in the United States. And a lot of Americans believe that they hear that giant sucking sound and associate it with the loss of so many American jobs in the past decade or so. How is it regarded in Mexico? Is it a great success? Is it a popular measure?
I certainly think you see much less popular pushback than what you see sort of if you're stumping out there as a candidate in the heartland of America today. And it's not surprising. Look, there has been a real economic impact as a result of the 2009 recession in the United States. There is a first generation of Americans whom you talk to, and when you go, one thing is speaking at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City or here at the World Affairs Council. Another one, completely different, is going to the Rotary Club in Indianapolis and speaking about trade and NAFTA, and you're going to get a very different body language from the audience. And people are hurting. I think many of them do sense or do feel that trade-related jobs have been leaving the United States. But if you look at the data, and I know that it is much harder to put this data in a bumper sticker than it is to say no to free trade. That fits nicely, neatly on a bumper sticker this big. And the data that I've given you, and I will continue to give you, it would take a bus-sized vehicle to sort of print on the back of that. But look, again, we trade $1 billion a day of goods and services. $1 billion a day. We are the number one or number two trading partner of 28 states in America today. And these aren't my numbers, these are the Chamber of Commerce. So, there are anywhere from 6 to 7 million jobs in those states directly related to trade with Mexico. So, you know, if you look at the numbers, if you see how much trade and trade-related growth has been driven by NAFTA, it should be easy to debunk some of what is out there as to the impact of NAFTA. The concerns that do exist in Mexico, most of them have to do with some of the impacts that you have seen in the Mexican rural sector. Corn is sort of usually brought out as proof of the impact that this has had. But even there, I would argue that the problems that we face in the Mexican rural sector are more the result of inadequate policies that have been put in place in Mexico since NAFTA was approved than as a result of NAFTA. Look at production of corn in Mexico. When NAFTA was approved in 1993, Mexico was producing around 17 million tons of corn per year. Mexico last year produced 56 million tons of corn. So it's not an issue of us not being able to compete and produce. It's an issue of how do small and medium, some of them subsistence farmers that grow corn, compete with highly subsidized, high yield, high technology agro businesses in Mexico that are the ones that are getting them out of the business. And how do you create a soft landing that will allow you as a government in Mexico to mitigate that social impact and that economic impact that we have seen in certain areas of the rural sector in Mexico. But again, look at the agribusiness between Mexico and the United States. It is one of the greatest success stories of our trade relationship. Why? Because we are both highly efficient and we have one unique beauty which hopefully will not be changed by climate change, you know, these 65-degree days that we're having in the middle of winter. So far, when you produce, we don't, and vice versa. So our agri-produce does not compete, it complements. And so, for example, if you look at exports in both directions of fresh produce, fruits, vegetables, there is a huge success story that has taken place there since NAFTA was approved.
As you mentioned, this is an election year in Mexico as well as the United States. I have a special connection to Mexican politics. I was once, it was left out of my introduction, but I was once the tutor of a former president of Mexico, long ago and far away. He has since left office. In Mexico, in this election year, the #1 concern of the voters appears to be crime. Tragically, more than 40,000 Mexicans have been killed in drug-related violence since President Calderon initiated the campaign in 2006 against the drug cartels. Ambassador, how would you assess the government's progress in its campaign against the drug cartels? Has it worked, and why is there so much public dissatisfaction?
Yeah, there's no doubt that the three main issues that will drive both the campaigns and how voters go to the polls in July in Mexico, two of them are no different than what they are in the United States, jobs and the economy, but there is a third one, which is public security. And there will be a very important debate in Mexico as to the strategy that has been followed, the decision to confront transnational organized crime, and sort of how do you either strengthen or fine-tune or redirect that strategy. I think that if you look at the polls in Mexico, if you look at polling, and there was a recent poll that just came out a few weeks ago by sort of one of the very respected polling houses in Mexico, there is, I think, a general conviction in Mexico above the 60% that the decision to confront organized crime, A, is the right one, and B, has to be sustained. Where I think there is a lot of debate and a lot of discussion is whether the policy mix, the tools that have been used to confront organized crime, are the correct ones. And why? Because obviously violent crime and, more importantly, homicides related to organized crime have sharply increased over these past 5 years. I would argue, and I don't know if we'll have time to go into depth, that regardless of the decision of the Mexican state to confront organized crime, the trend that we have seen of a growing number of homicides related to organized crime would have still gone up simply because of how organized crime has changed and morphed in Mexico for the past 10 years. What very few people understand is that there is one significant change which explains why organized crime in Mexico has suddenly become so violent. And that occurred probably in the mid-90s, when, as a result of Mexico's efforts to stem high tonnage, high volume trafficking of cocaine, if you remember the headlines back then, they were using reconverted 727s and Caravels to fly multi-tons of cocaine into the northern part of Mexico and then bring them across the border into the United States. When Mexico disrupted that air bridge, there was a very significant change which altered the profile and the face of organized crime in Mexico, which is that before then, organized crime in Mexico was basically just they were the shippers. The Colombian cartels would give them the cocaine. The Mexican syndicates would make sure that it traversed Mexico. They would put it on the other side of the border, and that was it. They didn't control the shipments. When we started disrupting the air bridge between Colombia and Mexico, the Colombians decided, or made the calculation, that their Mexican brethren would probably be better incentivized to make sure that the load got to the other side of the Mexican border by, instead of paying them in cash for their services, paying them in kind with cocaine. And this is what explains the dramatic shift in the power, the reach, and the corrupting abilities of the drug syndicates in Mexico. Because from one day to the next, they were, for the first time in the history of organized crime in Mexico, able to directly control shipments of cocaine and establish and develop their marketing, retail, distribution chains and networks in the United States. So profits soared in Mexico. And this completely changed not only their ability to make money, but the stakes. They were no longer only fighting for trafficking routes. They were starting to create a domestic demand for drugs in Mexico. And therefore, they were fighting for control of the street retail market that they had never cared about in the past. So this really morphed the role of organized crime. And so when the state, as a result of President Calderon's decision to push back against organized crime, starts launching its offensive, obviously this impacts the rising violence that was already starting to happen as a result of gang-on-gang feuds, and is responsible for this very important increase that we've seen. I think, Bill, and I've said this, my team winces now every time I say it because I've used it so often, but whoever thought that taking on organized crime was going to be an issue that we were going to solve in 3 years or even in the 6 years of President Calderon was probably smoking too much of what we're seizing. It's going to take time. It's going to take sustained attention and engagement by Mexico, by the United States, by other international partners. It is a generational challenge. But if you look at what has happened in places like Palermo, or what happened in Colombia, or what happened in New York and Chicago when sort of anti-organized crime policies were put in place, you will see that after year 5 or 6, sort of violent deaths related to organized crime start plateauing, and then in the next 4 to 5 years, there is a descendant curve. And we've already started to see that plateauing curve in Mexico. So I would probably adventure to say that if the strategies are maintained, if the focus is maintained, sure, there will be a very healthy and I think important debate as to how do you fine-tune, how do you refine, what is the role for civil society to play. But the main decision to confront organized crime and endemic corruption is maintained. I think you will start seeing some important results in the next 4 to 5 years in Mexico, but it is going to take time. No mistake about it.
I have one question to ask right now, and then I'm going to ask for questions from the audience. So if you have questions, prepare to ask them. I'll turn to you in just a moment. But my question is this. Mexico holds the presidency of the G20 in 2012 and will host the Leaders Summit in June. What are the top priorities Mexico intends to pursue as president of the G20?
Yeah, first of all, this is, and thanks for that infomercial, Bill. This is I think that the G20, as was the case with COP16 in Cancun last year, is demonstrating that Mexico is developing global solutions for global challenges. And I think that it's no surprise that, yes, we will have to deal with the stability of financial markets, and we will have to deal with the issue of regulations in the G20 summit in June. But we will also need to discuss other issues that are incredibly related to these important drivers of discussion, which are, for example, how do you connect the issue of sustainability and creation of green jobs as part of the G20 agenda, and also a very important issue which is going to be dead center in the discussions, which is very important for a country like Mexico, which is price of foodstuffs, of commodities, of the prices of food in the international market, because over the last years it has had such a disrupting effect on the economic performance, on social well-being. In many ways, yes, Twitter and Facebook, being a tweeter, I wouldn't say anything less, but in many ways, some of the very important, significant changes that have occurred in Northern Africa are not only the result of society mobilizing against dictatorships, it's a result of the impact of whether it's rising prices of oil or rising prices of food staples that have also triggered social mobility. So how do we think of and address the connection between the profound economic recession, how do we create growth with prices of food? The other issue that we will continue to insist upon is ensuring that we don't have a press conference in Cancun, in Cabo San Lucas. The leaders all commit to we won't establish protectionist tariffs, and the moment they leave, everyone is slapping on tariffs and additional barriers to trade, which is what has happened for the past 2 years. We need to ensure that we allow trade to flow freely and ensure that some of the tariffs that we've seen arise as a result of governments deciding to protect certain sectors and issues of their economies as a result of the 2009 recession does not replicate itself after Cabo San Lucas in June.
Thanks very much. I guess I have one little question. Do you tweet in English or Spanish, or both?
Bilingual. There are some that I only tweet in English. There are some that I only tweet in Spanish, but most of them I do bilingual.
All right. Question here.
Mr. Ambassador, Britt Minshall, member of the World Affairs Council since before the turn of the last century. Before I went into the pastorate, I spent 16 years in law enforcement. I worked mainly in the areas from New York to Atlantic City and down to Washington. In those cities that I worked in, we all knew, that is local officials, politicians, the lady who sold flowers on the corner, everybody knew exactly who the gangsters were, who the mob was. Most of us, pardon me, had some in our families. And yet they kept going and going and going, and they wouldn't stop. The only way our country got them pretty well under control was to have a super law enforcement level above the corrupt county, state, city officials, because they were just corrupt as they could be. My question is, in Mexico, I try to follow this, and my first question is, since everybody knows they must who these characters are, is there any plan to have some kind of investigative agency that can track the money? It's huge amounts of money, and that can go in and take these people down.
This is a very important question, because it goes to the core of the challenges that I think we're facing in this phase of the strategy in Mexico, which is, I think, these past 5 years have seen a very accelerated growth of the federal institutional template and capabilities. But now the rubber hits the road. And the problem is that most of the challenges that we are facing, and where most of the violence is coming from, is our inability to use state and local law enforcement to confront transnational organized crime. Not only because of the real power symmetries between some of these very violent organized crime syndicates and local police, when you're up against a mobster wielding a .50 caliber Barrett sniper rifle, and all you have is your standard issue revolver to repel that attack, it's pretty one-sided. So it's not only building up those capabilities, but confronting what I think is one of the most paradigmatic challenges that we face in Mexico, which is we are what we are because we were what we were. I'm not being frivolous. The challenge that we face is that, as most of you know, for 71 years plus of one-party control in Mexico, you had a fairly centralized law enforcement and policing system. When, as a result of the defeat of the PRI in 2000, the PAN comes in, that party decides to start devolving political power to the mayors and to the governors. And along with that, the control of the police, state or local, which before that had been sort of highly centralized and mostly focused on social political control more than on doing law enforcement. And it is those structural weaknesses in local and state law enforcement which were capitalized over these past 10 years by organized crime. And this is what created the type of corruption, endemic corruption at the state and local level, which we are now confronting. There has been a very important debate taking place in Mexico over the past year as to the creation of either a single federal police force, like the Carabineros in Chile or the National Police in Spain, so that there is a centralized command, control, and intelligence system of all police forces, or if that's not possible because there's a lot of blowback, of creating 32 federal police forces, but that all respond to a single command. There's been a lot of opposition because, as you can imagine, the paradox of devolving political power to a federal system like yours, to the governors and to the mayors, is that now the governors and mayors don't want to relinquish control of over their police forces. So there's been a lot of political opposition to this discussion. But in the meantime, I think what we have seen and what we have done is really enhance the capabilities of the federal institutions. One of the reasons why we see precisely a spike in bulk cash trafficking at the tune of about $8 billion a year coming from the United States into Mexico is because both in Mexico and with the United States, over the past years, we've been pretty successful in shutting down formal money laundering through the banking system, what police call smurfing. We've been so good at that that it's like playing whack-a-mole. We shut down money laundering through the banking system, but now they're bringing bulk cash back into Mexico across the border. So then it's not only about maintaining the pressure on preventing money laundering, but it's how do we use our assets on the border, both yours going south and ours coming from the north, to inspect vehicles, individuals, bringing bulk cash back into Mexico, which is then used to corrupt or to buy weapons or technology. So that is the big challenge. I think that if the question is, do you feel comfortable that the federal level in Mexico and the government-to-government relationship between the United States and Mexico, is that starting to produce the result? Most certainly. The challenge that we face now, and that is why the media initiative that Bill was mentioning will now start focusing at the state and local level, is that we now have to go down into the weeds where we have a lot of the problems of institutional weaknesses and endemic corruption.
We have time for one question, which we'll take from anyone over this side of the room.
Chachen from Bethesda, Maryland. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for your comment. In your opinion, what would be the critical element in the U.S. Immigration reform? Thank you.
How much time do I have?
I was going to say, it's a big question.
It's a big. I'll try and give you sort of my response in a nutshell. The question on immigration, I think the core challenge is to understand that any successful discussion on immigration reform in the United States has to have two key components: a temporary worker program and doing something regarding whether you want to call it legalization, a path to citizenship, a path to documentation. Why do these two issues have to go together? Because if you don't bind them together, the opponents of one will not support the other issue, and I'll explain. A temporary worker program, which is so important to provide circular labor mobility in a legal, orderly, transparent manner is so important for the future economic growth of Mexico, the United States, and Canada. That's why Mexico and Canada, for example, have had, for the past 30+ years, a very successful temporary worker program. You need to provide labor mobility across our borders so that willing employees can meet willing employees. It's an economic imperative. Businesses love a temporary worker program, but trade unions don't like a temporary worker program. The other issue, a path, whatever you want to call it, a path to citizenship, documentation. Trade unions love a path to citizenship because many of the people that will document their status will potentially become card-carrying, fee-paying members of a union. But sort of the conservative right hates the idea of what they call amnesty. The only way that you can ensure that both constituencies don't torpedo each other's interests is by binding these two core components together. You will get most but not all of what you want on the one hand, and the same with the other. And by binding them together, you make sure that unions don't torpedo a temporary worker program, and that those who oppose amnesty don't torpedo a path to documentation. Those, I think, are the core pillars, regardless of whatever else may be in the equation. But I think at the crux of the problem, if you solve this issue, you basically can solve the immigration conundrum in the United States.
I want to thank the ambassador. I would point out that this is a primary day in the United States. Sunday is a primary day in Mexico when the candidate of the PAN party, the PAN, the ruling party since, 2000, will be selected. And it's entirely possible that Mexico could end up this year with its first female president. What do you think the chances are of that?
Well, nice try, Bill. I think certainly there is a chance that the PAN could have its first female candidate for the presidency. In politics, as was evident in South Carolina, a week is a hell of a long time. A lot can happen. And so, you know, I would say let's wait and see what will happen in Mexico. But certainly the outcome of the primary, of the PAN primary on Sunday, which is basically pitting Josefina Vázquez Mota, the former PAN whip in Congress, against Ernesto Cordero, who was the finance minister with President Calderón, is going to be an important decision. We'll see what happens. I think it's a close race. I think it's too cold to call even today. And we'll see what happens on Sunday.
All right, and if it gets too confused, we'll send Newt Gingrich to Mexico to straighten us all out. I want to thank the ambassador for his eloquent and vigorous remarks, very informative, and for all of you for participating.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.